Okay, I'm not going to make this one too long because I've got a bit of a queue of videos lining up at the moment. 2019 marks exactly 400 years since the first slave ship arrived in the 13 colonies, specifically in Virginia. 400 years, so it's a big marking point, big anniversary. Inevitably, this will vocalise campaigners who say that it's time for reparations, it's time for an apology. There's other anniversaries as well, of course, specific anniversaries in specific years. Here in Britain, for example, we had a £2 coin to commemorate 200 years, as it then was 2007, to mark the abolition of the slave trade in Britain in 1807. It was abolished across the British Empire in 1833. So there's other anniversary markings, marking points. I think this is an opportunity to be honest about the transatlantic slave trade, but to be completely honest. And I think the problem with a lot of campaigners is they're not being completely honest. They're not presenting the whole picture. Now, to be clear here, I'm not talking about rights and wrongs of slavery. It was an evil, filthy trade. There's no justification for what it involved. I mean, it was the transportation en masse of human beings to be used as chattel. It was a disgusting, evil trade. There's no question about that. And many, many thousands, millions of which took the whole duration, suffered as a result. That's without question. Many died on the voyages over. There were filthy, cramped conditions. The sailors who were assigned to preside over those voyages were themselves brutalised, which didn't help matters. They were press-ganged often. And when they arrived in the New World, they were at the mercy of whatever sort of plantation owner it was. As a matter of practicality, actually the more brutal and extreme owners tended to actually be less profitable, in the sense that the slaves were property. So if a slave was too badly whipped or brutalised to the point where they couldn't physically work, that was actually bad for profit for that particular slave owner. So in a very twisted sort of way, they had to look after their property. There was a famous case, I believe it was about 1776, the Zool case, the Zoom, I forget, it began with the letter Z, but it was a famous case where the defendants were the ship owners, and the prosecution argued that slaveholders had lost their property on this particular voyage, as sailors had thrown over dead bodies in a storm. It was about 1776, I forget, it began with the letter Z, I forget off the top of my head. But I think that we need to look at the whole picture. One aspect of the transatlantic slave trade that is utterly overlooked is the fact that it was African chieftains sold their fellow Africans to the European slave traders. You know, it was a trade. It was a filthy trade, but it was a trade nonetheless. Why do we never hear about them? Also, if you look at, often these campaigners are very much of the narrative of collective white shaming, like white people enslaved black Africans. It's an overly simplistic look at history, because the vast majority of white Britons and Americans today are not directly descended to slave owners, but also, even then, the majority of white people were probably toiling in mills or coal mines, certainly not in a position to own slaves. The Confederate Army, if we look at the American Civil War, most of them was made up of farm boys, and that's not a justification for their cause either way, but I would say it's as much a class issue as a race issue. Although obviously you can't ignore the race factor. But those who are demanding reparations and apologies today, what would an apology do? Firstly, no government today is directly responsible for what happened. Secondly, I understand the argument that the way enslaved Africans were treated had reverberations through generations, and I think that needs to be acknowledged, particularly in America, where there was horrendous discrimination right up to the mid-20th century. But if we're going to talk about apologies, what about the slave trade today? Why this obsession with the transatlantic slave trade? I accept it was a major crime against humanity, it was an abomination. What about the Arab slave trade? That also enslaved millions of human beings. And what about slavery today? It's estimated somewhere in the region of 27 to 30 million people are in slavery today. If we look at Africa, Burkina Faso, the gold mining industry there is a lucrative trade, and it involves often child miners. They're basically slaves. There was an Islamist attack on one of these sites the other day, and the tragedy is the victims were probably child miners, 16 killed. But, you just have to look at the mining industries across the African continent. It's blatant exploitation. And yes, European consumers have a responsibility on what sort of jewellery they're buying. We all know about blood diamonds. But it's the issue I take is it's just about targeting one side. It's just about targeting Europeans and Americans. What about the culpability of African leaders? What about, for example, the responsibility of the Mauritanian government to act on the blatant slavery taking place in that country today? So unless campaigners are prepared to acknowledge those things, I think calling for an apology for something that happened a long, long time ago now just seems a bit pointless. We can acknowledge it, and we should acknowledge that cities like Liverpool and Bristol became wealthy through the slave trade. But when those students want to tear down statues and so on, are they going to hold the same contempt for African governments that aren't taking action today? I think there's a lot of hypocrisy there. So if we're going to look at an anniversary like this, if we're going to look at the transatlantic slave trade, let's look at slavery in general. Let's look at, if we want to go really far back, the Romans enslaved white so-called barbarian tribes, the Britons, Germanic tribes. They were enslaved white people by Romans. And you can find examples of that throughout history. Slavery is something that's plagued humanity, and it is not confined to the transatlantic slave trade. That's a mistake we sometimes make, assuming that slavery equates to just the transatlantic slave trade. It's well, well beyond that. It's an evil thing, and it happens today. So let's just have some consistency.